All right, you're good.
All right. Well, hi everyone. So my name is Jon Edwards, and I've been at UofSC for 6 years. Now, I earned my PhD in rhetoric and communication from Northwestern University, and I'm currently the basic course director for the public speaking program here at the university. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that I've done for a number of years now for the graduate school. So a program that I'm sure some of you have probably seen before, and for those of you who have, I apologize. But what I want to do today is sort of divide it into two parts. And there is the boring part, which everyone who's watching this on the camera can see. And then there's the far more interesting part afterwards. The boring part is me talking. And I'm going to try to keep that to a relative minimum. And then after that, we're going to shift over into basically a workshop format and work through some of the elements that I've just talked about. And this is basically, the focus of this is on how to present your research, how to talk about what it is you do to what I describe as educated, non-specialist audiences. So people who are reasonably smart, they're reasonably intelligent, but they don't know what you do. They don't speak the language of your discipline. They don't have any foundation for understanding what your work is and why your work is valuable. So at a very basic level, you can think something like family gatherings where people ask you why you're in graduate school or why you finished your PhD or what your PhD is in, what it is you do. You can think about things like conferences, particularly large conferences where people from multiple disciplines are milling around and you're trying to explain yourself. And frankly, and some of you have experienced this before, also interviews where you will end up talking to people who are in your discipline. You'll give plenty of time with them. But in most cases, you'll also talk to program directors, you'll talk to provosts. Had the experience in small colleges of speaking to university presidents before. And these are people who are very smart, they're very educated, but they don't know what you do. And they don't speak that language. And to be able to describe for them in reasonably clear terms what you do and why it's valuable, and particularly why it's valuable to them. All right, so I'm a rhetorician. I make no apologies for that. And so the framework that I use to talk this through is based on the rhetorical canon. And so there are 5 steps, essentially, in the canon emerging, popularized by Cicero. And those 5 steps are invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And I want to use each of those to basically walk us through what this kind of presentation looks like. All right, so starting with invention. Invention is essentially about the gathering together of stuff, figuring out what the content of your speech is going to be. And that inevitably begins with figuring out who it is you're talking to. So who is the audience for your speech? What do they want from you? Presumably they know what you want. You want a job, you want funding. What do they want? What value are you providing to them? Either as a teacher, as a researcher, as someone who can bring in grant funding. What is the value that you provide for a department, for a university, whatever it is you're trying to talk? What do they know? How knowledgeable is your audience about your subject matter? And this is essentially guesswork. What do they think they know? Which of course is not the same thing. What do they believe about your topic? Because we've all had the experience of people who know very little but who know it very loudly and who can tell us far more about our own research fields than we ever could. So how opinionated are they? How much resistance are you likely to face when you're talking to them about your work, and how much are you going to sort of have to disabuse them of in the process of walking through your research and its value? And then ultimately, why should they care? Because everyone is inherently selfish. They're self-interested, and they want to know what you bring to the table. And then from there, we move into 4 questions. And these are the 4 questions that are going to form the basis for the workshop in a few minutes. So starting from a general assessment of the audience, the 4 questions are: what problem do you solve? Or what question do you answer? So thinking about your own work, your own research. Why is the problem worth solving? Or why is the question worth answering? And this may have multiple levels to it. Knowledge for its own sake has inherent value, but also thinking in terms of the educational value of what you do, logistical value of what you do, the practical implications moving forward of what you do. Many of us are theorists, myself included. We tend to think in abstraction, and we tend to view the abstraction as an inherent value in itself, and within our own disciplines that makes sense. But being able to step back from that and figure out what does that abstraction have to do with other disciplines, other fields, and sort of day-to-day lives of the people you encounter. Why is yours the best solution? Why is yours the best answer? And again, that's a relative term. There are many good answers out there. But why does yours have particular value? Why is this worth pursuing? Why is this worth giving research time for? Why is this publishable? Why is this fundable? And then finally, the sort of most abstract question. What is your value? Thinking in terms of the first 3 questions, bringing it together. What is the particular value that you bring for the audience you're addressing? As you're working through those questions, and we'll do this in a few minutes, as you're working through those questions, remain specific. Avoid the temptation to abstract out, avoid the temptation to wax into jargon and talking about the details of what you do. Jargon is fantastic, but jargon can also be a crutch. In other words, sometimes if we're using it effectively, it acts as a tool for efficiency. It's like notation in mathematics. It allows us to get past all the things we already know in order to get to the things we don't know. But when we're talking to people who don't speak that language, jargon can function as a crutch. It makes us sound smart without making the person you're addressing feel any smarter or feel any more engaged with what it is that you're working on. All right, so once you've gathered the stuff, once you have a sense of what it is you want to talk about, what your subject matter is, then you move into arrangement, which is the basic organization of the stuff. Putting it together into a basic format. And in terms of outlining a speech, I like to think in terms first of first words and last words. In other words, what is the very first thing you're going to say to someone? What's the first sentence that's going to come out of your mouth? How are you going to grab a person? Just like reading an essay. What grabs you? What captures you? How would you summarize what it is that you do in a compelling way so that the person wants to keep listening to you moving forward? And then what are the last words that you're going to say? How are you going to end? How are you going to walk away? In between, what are the main ideas? So, general rule of thumb when it comes to speech making. Audiences are incredibly forgetful. You just don't remember things all that well. And you are having a good day if an audience remembers 2 or 3 things out of any given speech. And that's length indeterminate. If you talk for an hour, your audience is going to remember 2 or 3 things. If you talk for 5 minutes, it's about the same. They're not going to remember the details. Sorry. And you can fight against that. You can get really frustrated by it, or you can use it to your advantage. Recognize they're not going to remember it. So they're only going to get a couple of things that you get to get across to them that are actually going to be meaningful. So make those things count and figure out what they are. One of the big differences between effective and ineffective speakers is that an ineffective speaker will present a lot of information and essentially leave it up to the audience to sort it out, to figure out what's most important, what's most meaningful. They'll remember 2 or 3 things, but it's basically random. You've lost control. And your goal as a speaker is always to maintain as much control as you can. And so you decide up front what's most important, and then you can emphasize those points. You can clarify them, you can repeat them, you can drive them home, you can make it clear to the person that if you forget everything else that I've said to you, this is what I want you to walk away with. And sometimes it's helpful to go even beyond that, to think about the one thing. So forget 2 or 3. If you had this person remember one thing a week after they talk to you, what would it be? What would you most want to be remembered for? When they think about you, when they pull your business card out of their pocket a week after the conference, what is it that you want to flash through their mind? If you have a clear sense of that, hopefully you can communicate it effectively, and hopefully that's actually the thing that they remember. All right, and that moves in also to talking about visuals. Now, this is the kind of speaking that takes place in many different formats. And sometimes this is the kind of talking you do in a coffee line at a conference. And it's going to be very informal. What do you do? Let me tell you. Sometimes this is more formal. When we're talking about the 3-minute thesis, the TMT, this is something that's a much more formal setup with clearly defined rules, and you have to only speak for 3 minutes, and you have a minimum of 1 slide. I want to talk briefly about visual aids, just because I think that it's worth mentioning, even though it won't always be a part of a speech like this. So as you can probably tell just from what I've shown you so far, I tend to be a minimalist. I tend to think that when it comes to visual aids, less is more. My general rule of thumb, and the rule that I'll tell my students, is you want whatever is on the screen to enhance what you're saying, but it should absolutely never replace what you're saying. So word for word lecture notes on PowerPoint are great if you're giving your students study guides. They're really bad as a presentation because we can read far faster than you can talk. And so if I've read to the bottom of your slide, I don't have to listen to you anymore. And if you've given me all the information on the slide, then there's really no reason for you to be there at all. I could just read the information, get the information, and you become essentially irrelevant. You want to stay relevant. So whatever is up there should only be valuable if you're there to add to it. So keep things simple. Limit yourself to core ideas, basic principles. Only use words if you have to, and only use words if those words are adding substantive value. Same thing goes with images. If a picture is on your slide, it should be there because it adds real meaning. Please, for the love of all that's whatever, don't use PowerPoint. I'm sorry, don't use clip art in your presentations. It is worse than useless because not only does it look like you couldn't find a good image, but it looks like you're relying on the image as a kind of crutch that gets you through without, again, adding anything substantive. So something's big enough to put on screen should be big enough to be meaningful. And sometimes nothing is actually the best policy. So one problem that speakers sometimes have is we're so desperate to make sure that we have a slide for every point that we're going to make that we end up stuffing information onto the visual. And something that I learned the very first job I ever took when I was working as an economic development consultant is inserting blank slides into presentations. If you don't have something, make it go away. When you do have something, you're trying to avoid this. This is coming from the Department of Defense, which incidentally is always a good place to go for what not to do. Examples. this is busy, this is meaningless. So except for what I'm using it for right now as an example of what not to do in visual aids and presentations, this is functionally meaningless because it has so much information that the information is not legible. You can't read it. The alternative is something that's incredibly simple. Stripping away everything else, simply taking one idea, highlighting it, making it central. This number is important. This is what I want you to remember. All right, this number is not actually important. I just pulled it out of nowhere. It has no meaning. But in the context of a presentation, this is a number that I'm likely to remember. As you come back to it, you refer to it. This is something that when I think about you, I'm going to remember the 89%. And I'm not always a big fan of sort of glomming on to corporate models, but when it comes to presentations, it's sometimes helpful. So you look at things like Nike, where you're taking, again, minimal text and numbers that have no meaning outside of the presentation. I don't know what that means. I'm assuming those numbers are important because they're worth putting up on a screen. But without hearing the talk, I don't have the context to understand what those numbers mean. In other words, it's enhancing the speech, it's not replacing the speech. Something like Elon Musk presenting very, very minimal images. Of course, Apple, who everybody just copies. If you're going to use an image, that image should do something that you can't do with words alone. So saying our stuff is thin doesn't quite capture the aesthetic that the image does. And so you use the picture because it's doing something substantive. And then again, if you don't have information, don't try to force information in. All right, so that all brings us to style. Invention, arrangement, style. And style is actually choosing the words that you use. So this is basic. A lot of you are in the humanities already. Use active language. Avoid technical terms. Avoid jargon. Again, it has a place. Its place is not this kind of presentation. Define your terms. Thinking in terms of how you would present yourself or your research or your work if you were talking to a group of incoming freshmen. Think about how would you make yourself or your work seem interesting? How would you make it seem cool? I think I've said in other contexts, the difference between university freshmen and university presidents is not that big. Because ultimately, presidents are interested in selling whatever it is you do. They want to know what's interesting, they want to know what's cool, they don't care that much about the technical details of your research. They want to know how to pitch it. So in this kind of context, make it easy to talk that through. And always come back to the audience. How do we benefit? How does the world become better if we know this thing that we didn't know before? If we understand this context that we didn't have before, if we've been able to solve this problem, whatever it is you're doing, how does it make the world a better place? Doesn't mean it has to be big. Doesn't mean that you have to be curing cancer. But how are you making the world better? Why is this knowledge worth having? All right, memory. So Cicero is actually one of the first to really shift the thinking on memory, because earlier thought on memory was pretty basic. You would write out a speech, word for word, and then you would memorize it. Cicero was one of the earlier speakers who started shifting away from that. And I would never, ever tell anyone to try to memorize a text. Because A, it's really time-consuming, and B, it's really counterproductive. Because speaking is all about contingency. It's all about responding to the moment. What happens if the PowerPoint goes away? What happens if the electricity blacks out. What happens when something happens? You have your note cards in your hand and you're shaking and they go everywhere. If you've memorized a text and you're relying on that text, when that happens, you're done. You're not coming back from that because you're going to spend the entire time scrambling trying to remember where it was you left off. So you don't memorize a speech, you memorize a structure. What are the points that you want to get across? What is the order of those points? If you have the structure down pat, then whatever else happens, if you lose your place, something goes on in the room, if you get distracted, if you get off course, you at least know you have the map in your head of where you want to get back to. So whatever the exact words are that you choose, you know, okay, I'm on point 2, I know where point 3 is, and you can steer back in that direction. And it's much easier to maintain poise and to act like you know what you're doing, which speaking is very much about faking knowing what you're doing, even if you don't feel like it. You can maintain that poise a lot more effectively if you're focused on the structure and not on the actual words, word for word, what am I going to say. There is absolutely no substitute for practice. And I am one of those people who I know in some speech classes people talk a lot about using cameras or practicing in front of mirrors. I have never found that useful for me personally. So if it's something that helps you, by all means. But the one thing I would say, the one thing I always tell people is practice in front of people if at all possible. This is a great time to start bribing people. Call in favors, offer them food, whatever it is you have to do to get a couple of people who will sit down and who will listen to you. And even if people aren't there, anytime you're prepping for a presentation, you want to treat it as though it were live. So you obviously need to stand up, and if you make a mistake, or let's just say when you make a mistake, because it will inevitably happen, you want to avoid the temptation to do what most of us do when we're practicing by ourselves, which is to back all the way up to the start and start over again. You treat everything like it's live. So if you make a mistake, take a breath and keep going. Because if you're talking in front of an audience and you make a mistake, you have to take a breath and keep going. You don't have the option of backing all the way back up to the front. So treat everything like it's live. And then always think forward. Prep for the worst. What's going to happen if your video doesn't play? What's going to happen if the PowerPoint simply doesn't work? What's going to happen if the notes go everywhere? What's going to happen if you reverse points in the middle of a speech? Think through these things, because if you speak enough, they will inevitably happen. And the difference in many ways between an effective and an ineffective speaker is not what's going on when everything is going right, but what happens, how you respond when things don't go right. Because audiences are incredibly forgiving, right? We want people to do well. It actually makes us uncomfortable when people aren't doing well. And you've all experienced that all, and it makes us genuinely uncomfortable. Most of the time. We really don't like the person. I suppose we could be happy. But most of the time, it makes us really uncomfortable. We want it to stop. And because we tend to want people to do well, it means that as audience members, we tend to overlook mistakes. We're not going to remember it. If you don't draw attention to it, you don't panic, you don't freak out, we are not going to remember it. So never ever start a speech by telling people how nervous you are. Never start a speech by telling people what a bad speaker you are, or how you're terrified of the circumstance of the audience, or how little you know, or anything like that. If you make a mistake, don't apologize for it. All right? If something really bad happens, if the PowerPoint futzes out, something like that, say, sorry about that, and move on. But most of the time, if you stumble, don't apologize for it. Don't draw attention to it. Just keep going. And chances are no one's going to remember that it happened. And so that means you have to think about yourself physically. Sometimes you have a podium. Podiums are great. many times you don't. So thinking about movement and gesture is important. So let me just talk this through. So first of all, what do you do with your hands when you're giving a speech? Maybe I should say, what do you not do with your hands?
Put them in your pockets.
Please do not put them in pockets. They're little miniature black holes. They don't come back out again.
Don't hold them straight at your sides.
Yeah. I've seen people, including some professors, give entire speeches looking like they're about to throw a punch. Because a lot of what you're doing when you're talking about movement and gesture, it has to do with essentially keeping your muscles loose, because your muscles are trying to tighten up because you're nervous. Not all of you are nervous speakers. Some of you are. If this is something that makes you nervous, it's going to mean that your muscles are naturally going to start to tighten, and you don't want to let them. Good rule of thumb is to always keep your hands up above your waist. Simply because if your hands are up above your waist, you're naturally going to tend to move them. There isn't an exact science. There used to be. Back in the 19th century, they had a discipline called elocution, or letters and numbers on big spheres, and people were supposed to move in particular ways. I sadly do not have a big sphere, although I really wish I did. We don't have a particular science for movement. You're trying to find a space that looks natural to an audience. And that's tricky, of course, because what looks natural to an audience isn't necessarily going to feel natural to you, particularly if you haven't spoken a lot. So you're trying not to fling your arms out in all directions, but at the same time, you want to keep them moving. Does anyone shake when they speak? All right, I do too. It's not actually too bad right now. Look, I talk a lot. This is basically what I got my PhD in. This is sort of what I do for a living. And my right hand shakes. If I'm up in front of an audience, I don't know. If I'm talking about material, I don't know. If I'm just nervous, my right hand will tend to shake. It's musculature, it's nerves. There's not really anything I can do about it. But how do you conceal trembling? Keep the hand moving. You don't draw attention to it. No one's paying. Yeah, don't. Try not to hold things. Those are the moments when I can tell, like, don't hold pieces of paper, anything like that. You don't draw attention to it. You may be aware of it. In fact, we're hyper aware of it. The same thing goes if your voice is trembling. You're tightening up. Everything is tightening up. Breathe. Movement is the exact same way. If you don't have a podium, you have to move. And it's not an abstract rule. You have to move because you can't not move. All right. If it's a short presentation, a couple of minutes long, then you can probably stand perfectly still. But if it's anything longer than that, you're either going to lock your knees and pass out, which is probably amusing for students, but not all that helpful for you, or you're going to start to sway, inevitably, because you're going to start taking the pressure off your knees however you can. And so rather than swaying back and forth, you just get in the habit of taking a few steps. Take a few steps, you pause, take another few steps, don't pace. So it is an exercise. You're not sort of walking back and forth the whole time. But again, some people are going to move more, some are going to move less, but you have to move. At least enough to keep your muscles loose as you're going through the process. All right, when it comes to eye contact, when I'm talking in a group this size, one of the things that I have tried to do over the last few minutes is make eye contact with every single person in the room. Why?
I mean, it makes us feel engaged.
Yeah. For that moment, I'm talking to you. It adds a level of responsibility for you as audience members, helps people stay awake, in theory at least. It adds a level of intimacy and connection. If you're talking to a small audience, the ideal is always to try to make eye contact with everybody. Now, if you're a nervous speaker, the thing that I will always tell my students is if you're a nervous speaker and eye contact is difficult, then the thing that I would advise you to do is to find a friendly person in the audience, and there is always at least one, someone who's willing to smile at you or nod at you or laugh at your joke. Find that person and stare them down. It is uncomfortable for you, it is uncomfortable for them, and they will never ever be nice to anyone ever as long as they keep attending these things. But from an audience perspective, your goal is to get your eyes up at the horizon, because the temptation is to either stare down at the floor or stare up at the ceiling. And so even if you're only staring at one poor person who was nice to you, it looks from an audience perspective as though your eyes are up at audience level. And then hopefully as you practice more, as you get more comfortable, you can get off of that one poor person and start shifting your eyes around. But it's all about perception, getting your eyes at least up at the level of the audience to start. All right, rate. Everyone is going to talk at a different rate. Some people are much faster, some people are much slower. My goal when I teach is never to try to make everyone sound the same, because it's boring and it's not particularly effective. So here's the thing. If you are naturally a slow speaker, then the thing that I would always focus on is integrating places where you can create excitement in the speech, because the danger if you're a slow speaker is that you go essentially monotone. And so the speech becomes entirely flat, affect. It's sort of the teacher in the Charlie Brown cartoon. It's that womp, womp, womp in the background. And so if you are naturally a slow speaker, find places where either through movement, eye contact, volume, something, you can elevate the excitement level in the room to make sure that you're keeping it moving so that you're not falling into that monotone space. If you're naturally a fast speaker, the danger is essentially that you run roughshod over the audience. So you're on point 2, but they're still trying to figure out what you said on point 1, and ultimately they just wind up frustrated and confused. And so if you're naturally a fast speaker, typically I would not try to slow you down unless you're talking so fast that you start tripping over your own words. In that case, yes, you do need to slow down. But in most cases, the key is not lowering your speed, it's integrating deliberate pauses. In other words, let yourself go, but find stopping points, places where you can essentially let the audience catch up, points that are of particular significance, you want people to remember, bring it to a pause deliberately, let people catch up, and then move forward. So rather than just sort of one fast-paced session that makes it sound like you're trying desperately to get off the stage, you integrate energy and you create this space for the audience to stay with you. All right, when it comes to volume, it's all about the balance. Obviously, you want to be heard, particularly if you're not mic'd. You want to make sure that everyone in the room can hear you. You also ideally want your bass volume, the normal level that you speak at, just going to be a little bit louder than you would normally if you're just conversational. You want your bass volume to be loud enough that if I want to go quiet, in other words, if I really think this is an important point and I want you to pay attention, I can lower my voice, and presumably the back row can still hear me. And if I want to go up, if I want to shout, because I think this matters and I think that you need to remember it, I can do that and hopefully not blow out the eardrums of the people on the front row. All right, and then finally, pauses. And the thing I want to mention is vocalization when we pause. So the ums and the uhs. So why do we vocalize pauses when we speak?
Silence is deadly.
Silence is deadly. Silence feels horrible when you're up here, particularly if you were the one who caused the silence. If you somehow tripped over or you lost your place or something went wrong, silence feels horrible because all of a sudden everybody's staring at you, they're waiting to go on, you don't have anything substantive to say, And so you switch into sounds or words that don't have any actual meaning associated with them. If I had one piece of advice to offer in terms of delivery for any speaker, it would be to get rid of the vocalized pauses. Just full stop. And that takes time. If that's something that you struggle with, that takes time and it takes deliberate effort to get past. But it is well worth it. Because there are very few things in terms of single things that you can do that will make you sound more confident. When you feel more confident or not, that's a different thing. But in terms of sounding more confident, there are very few things that you can do that will help you more than getting rid of the vocalized pauses. And that also means getting comfortable with silence. So silence is not your enemy. Silence can be a friend. It can snap people awake. It can help them pay attention. And even if you caused it, all right? Let's say you've got the note cards, you drop them, they go everywhere. Take a breath, pause, down, pick them up, find your place, take another breath, start talking again. No one's going to throw anything at you. No one's going to yell at you. No one's going to leave. No one's going to remember that it happened. And I think that's the key thing to keep in mind. If you don't panic, if all you say is oops, and you bend down and you pick it up and you just keep going, no one's going to remember that it happened. Or if they do, they're going to remember it as this thing that happens to everybody that you worked right through. If you don't panic, we're not going to panic. And it's all about faking your way through the confidence that you may or may not feel when you're up here. All right, so that was the boring part out of the way. Questions on anything?
So is it, would you advise inserting humor into the speech as well? Like if you do drop your note cards or if the power goes out, is it okay to do that?
That's tricky. The question always is, are you funny? So humor is high risk. Humor is high risk, high reward.
Yeah.
If it works, it's fantastic. If it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. And the same goes with any kind of real emotion building. So if you can make an audience laugh or you can make them cry, for that moment, you've got them. And you've got them in a way that you really can't get them otherwise. They are physically involved in the speech, and they will remember it so much better. So if you can insert humor, then I would say, by all means. If you can't, be prepared at least for the joke that goes completely flat. And be prepared for moving on if no one gets it or no one laughs. Because I think that's one of those, you're setting yourself up for a sort of best case, worst case. The best case is everyone laughs, it's great. The worst case is crickets. And you want to prep for crickets. So if no one thinks you're funny, which I'm sure would never happen, but if no one thinks you're funny, then how do you recover from that? And how do you just sort of keep moving?